Good evening. Tonight, ICCO Canada and myself would like to welcome back the consortium of Prosciutto di Parma, who sponsored this series of classes. Also, welcome Roberto Fracchioni, chef, food consultant, and the Canadian brand ambassador of the Prosciutto di Parma. We hope you enjoyed our Calabrese dinner last Tuesday. Tonight, we're back in the Emilia-Romagna region, where some of the most popular and internationally renowned Italian products and ingredients come from. This time, Roberto will use prosciutto di Parma in a pasta dish, as well as in an incredibly tasty platter, suitable for any types of meals all year round. Remember, always look for the 5-pointed Parma crown, which identifies the prosciutto di Parma when you do your groceries. Only hams produced in the countryside surrounding the city of Parma in north-central Italy will have one, fire branded on its skin. Ask your server at the daily counter to show it to you, and remember to have the prosciutto sliced super thin. Before we start, I would like to invite you to join us next Tuesday for the TUTTI a TAVOLA in Calabria class, which will feature a full menu, including stuffed eggplant. Roberto will be back on November 10th with another prosciutto di Parma tasty recipe. Also, please mark your calendar and stay tuned for the International Week of Italian Cuisine. On Wednesday, November 25th at 6 p.m., ICCO Canada will present ICCO Canada Pentola d'Oro Under the Stars, an online event featuring excellence in food and wine with the participation of a Michelin star chef live from Italy and the award-winning ceremony for outstanding Canadian and Italian individuals and businesses who made a difference in the food and beverage industry. But now it's time for Roberto to start. How are you, Roberto? I guess
I'm awesome.
Oh, that's great.
I'm just turning my water down. It was boiling a bit too much. Sorry.
Oh, there you go. So it's time for you to start and show us your pasta dish tonight. So
awesome. Okay.
Let's get started.
Okay. Welcome back, everybody. So again, we're cooking with prosciutto di Parma. So today we're going to do a couple of things a little bit different than last week. Last week was about showing you how to use prosciutto di Parma for breakfast. This is more of a lunch sort of themed menu. So we're going to do kind of like a charcuterie board, but taking it to another level altogether. I call it a Contadino platter, which means a farmer's platter. And it's something that I kind of throw together when I don't have time and, you know, my son's hungry. And so we're going to do that. And we're also going to do a pasta. Now, a super simple pasta. This is my go-to pasta when, again, I don't have time. It's kind of a theme coming up here. So when I don't have a lot of time, I throw this pasta together. It really, really doesn't take much time at all. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to do the Contadino platter. So very, very simple. I listed a bunch of ingredients on the recipe, but those are suggestions. Just like any recipe, they should always be considered suggestions. So I have here a whole bunch of stuff that I just kind of grabbed. Now, the one thing that I use this dish for is when you open your fridge and you can't find room in it because you have all these jars of olives and some roasted peppers and all these like little tiny bits of stuff in the bottom of a glass jar, pull it all out and throw it onto a platter. It's super, super easy. So on what I did when I cleaned out my fridge today, what I got was a couple kinds of olives. We have some roasted peppers. We have some artichokes, some mushrooms that are, you know, preserved with a little bit of oil, some pickled wild onions. What else is in here? Some grapes, and then a little bit of green vegetables. So I have some green beans and some asparagus and some rapini. So very simple ingredients. Just a little bit of olive tapenade as well. And we just need a couple minutes to do the prep. Now, what I'm going to do is start with my artichokes. So these are my little artichokes. These are the ones that come in the can already made. If you want to go crazy, yes, pull out some artichokes, get out your bread knife, get a pot of water. You can cook artichokes. They're not that difficult. They're time consuming, but they're not that difficult. But For convenience sake, I'm just going to use the pre-made little artichoke hearts. So all I'm going to do here is cut them into quarters. So keeping them fairly large so that you can tell what they are. So you can see that it's an artichoke and it doesn't sort of disappear on the plate. The other little bit of prep that we have to do is the tomatoes. So we have 3 kinds of heirloom tomatoes here, yellow, red, and then a green guy. I just do this for color. It doesn't have to be, you know, these kind of tomatoes, but they just look a little nicer on the platter. Now, when it comes to making this platter, it's all about the presentation. You really want to focus a bit on the presentation. So we're just going to take some multicolored tomatoes and just cut them into little wedges. And again, keeping them fairly big. So I'm cutting this tomato into about an 1/8, 8 slices per tomato. And then we put them into a mixing bowl. So tomatoes into a mixing bowl. And same with the green. So even though this is a Prosciutto di Parma class, don't be confused by the fact that I'm doing so many other vegetables, because the prosciutto is the star of this dish. So once I get these tomatoes done, that's pretty much all of our prep. Now on the list, you'll see that I had listed figs, and I kind of went crazy looking for figs. They were in the grocery store 2 weeks ago, and then when I wanted them, I went looking and they weren't there. So word of warning, when you see them, just buy them. So our tomatoes are all here ready to go. All we're going to do now is drizzle a little bit of olive oil and a little bit of balsamic vinegar right on top of here. Don't be shy. And let me move this so I can put that down. Don't be shy with your olive oil. You want some real flavor on your tomatoes. And the balsamic vinegar, I just want to show you guys this. Sometimes you get a balsamic vinegar and, you know, you have to pour it. So you put your finger on top and you pour it. Then you get sticky balsamic vinegar on your finger. So what you do, get one of these nice illegal plastic straws. Don't tell the enviro police that I'm doing this. Stick it into the bottle, and then you put your finger on the top. And you kind of make a little vacuum. And that way, when you pick it up, the balsamic vinegar is inside the straw. And then you let your thumb off. And you just do a nice light little drizzle. You can kind of control the amount of balsamic and control exactly where you want it to go. It's kind of like using an eyedropper. And it's just a little cleaner way of doing it. And then the best part is you get to lick the straw afterwards. And you get a nice little hit of balsamic. So that's our prep for the platter. I've did a couple of things ahead of time. The vegetables I already blanched. So we have green beans and a couple of asparagus. Again, I know it's kind of out of season, but I wanted something green, and a little bit of rapini. So this can be anything. You don't have to do these ingredients. These are just ingredients that are available in the grocery store when I went cruising through. So I just grabbed them. You want to have some green on this plate. You want some vegetables on this platter. And the reason is because it's not a charcuterie platter. Okay, don't think about it as a meat and cheese board. This is so much more. You want this to basically be an entire meal on a plate. So our rapini goes into a mixing bowl, and we just toss it with a little bit of olive oil and a little bit of salt and pepper. Now, I'm staying away from garlic on this dish, and I'll explain why. If you put garlic into the rapini, it's wonderful. I love cooking with garlic. I love putting it on the rapini, but it really overpowers the dish. Prosciutto itself, it has so much flavor, and we have so much going on this board already. If I were to put raw garlic in here, you would just eat a piece of the vegetables, and the raw garlic would linger on your palate for a very, very, very long time. So we're just going to do a little bit of olive oil, not even any vinegar, and a little salt and pepper, and that's that. So before I start cooking, are there any questions?
Yes, actually, there is one. It says, you mentioned that your prosciutto should be cut as thin as possible. It seems to dry out so quickly that way. I like a thicker cut both for taste and freshness. My favorite is a cut at 1 or 1.5 on the meat cutter. Can you please comment?
So the dials on meat cutters, there's numbers 1 to 5. They are somewhat arbitrary because different manufacturers have different, gauges for their numbers. On top of that, as you use a meat slicer, that number sort of changes. The carriage itself kind of slips down. So if you have an older meat slicer that's used quite a bit, if you put it on 1, it doesn't mean it's 1 millimeter or it's a 1/16 of an inch. So don't worry about numbers because it changes store to store. What you want to do is get your prosciutto sliced as often as possible. Eat it within a few days of it being purchased, and store it properly. So when you store it, put it in a Ziploc bag. At the deli counters, they'll give you the little plastic bags. Some deli counters that don't seal, they just sort of fold over and then they tape them closed. Air is still getting in and air is still getting out when you have those containers. So if you do have to store it for a day or two, make sure it goes into a Ziploc bag and then put it on your counter and push out as much air as you possibly can. If it's drying out, then, I mean, it's not the prosciutto's fault. It just means you should be buying it more often. But if you do cut it thicker, you can cut it thicker if you really want to, but you just lose the beauty of the prosciutto when you do it that way. Thinner prosciutto, if you eat it side by side with prosciutto that's cut a lot thicker, it's a completely different flavor profile. So yeah, I don't know. Keep it dry, eat it faster. You should be okay.
Thank you.
Sorry, very long answer to a question. Any other questions, or should I just keep on?
Yeah, I'll ask you something else as well. Are there any brands of prosciutto di Parma that are better than others?
That's a bit of a loaded question. As the Canadian brand ambassador, I shouldn't pick favorites. I really shouldn't. I've tried a lot of prosciutto di Parma. Some is fantastic and some makes you want to cry because it's even better than that. So they're all great. Are there some people who put a little more love into it? Yes. Are there some people who age it more? Yes. I prefer one that's aged a little bit longer, but only if it's a larger leg to begin with. And it's a very personal thing. It's very, even if you take all the prosciuttos in the world and you decide prosciutto di Parma is your favorite, and you should think that, even in prosciutto di Parma, between all the 120 producers, some people are going to love one style and some people are going to love the other style. So it's just like wine. When you find a brand that you like, you stick with it.
Okay. Thank you.
Did I dodge the question? I was like a politician there. I didn't answer the question while answering the question. That was awesome.
That was a good answer. Thank you.
So we're going to start assembling the platter. If you have other questions, you can ask me questions, Tiziana, while I'm plating this.
Okay.
It's not that, I don't need that much attention. So
okay.
The platter itself, get something that is way bigger than you think you need. That way you have lots of space. You need a large canvas for this dish. We're making something beautiful as well as delicious, and having a little bit of elbow room, having a little bit of space to put everything on makes a massive difference. So I'm just using this slab of wood from a tree that fell down in my backyard that I cut. So it's just, a wood platter. And we're going to start assembling everything onto the platter. Now, when you're doing this, take your time. Don't just start slapping it on there. And think about two things. You want to think about height, and you want to think about spreading all your ingredients out. So I'm putting the prosciutto on, and you can see just that alone has a nice bit of height. You can see if I show you from the side, nice and height. If you take your prosciutto, and I see, people do this with charcuterie boards all the time, where they'll take it and they'll just put it down flat like that. I don't know. I don't dig it. If you like it, do it that way, but I like putting height into my dishes. So we're gonna do 3 little slices of the prosciutto, just sort of scattered around the board. And when I do this, I do 1 board per person. If you're doing it for multiple people, then you need a really giant board, which is cool too. You can do that. But ideally, I like doing 1 per person so that everybody, you know, can eat everything and not have to fight and have that awkward moment where there's 1 slice of prosciutto on the plate and there's like, oh, who's going to eat it? Oh, no, is she going to eat it? I don't want to be rude. I don't want to eat it. No, just give everybody their own plate and everything is wonderful. The olives I'm putting on and I'm nestling them close to the prosciutto itself so that they sort of stay in place. If you, as I do that and they flop all over. If you put them in the middle of the board, they're just going to roll around as you're trying to carry it to the table. So just sort of put them on and around near the prosciutto. I'm going to put a few more on top of the rapini after the rapini goes down. And all we do here is we just start layering everything. We just start putting everything on, spreading it out across the table or across the board so that everybody, you know, doesn't have to fight. And you have the room, like I said earlier, to make sure that you can see exactly what is on the plate. So we have a little bit of roasted peppers here. And again, I'm, you know, full disclosure, these are roasted peppers out of a jar. Every now and again, I don't want to go outside and fire up the barbecue and roast off peppers. So I always have a little jar of roasted peppers kind of hiding in the back of my fridge that I use for occasions like this, where I have 15 minutes to throw a little platter together. We have our mushrooms here, and these are pretty beautiful. So I'm going to make them nice front and center, like that.
Roberto, can I ask you
Yes.
a question? What is the recommended serving size for prosciutto?
So for a platter like this, I usually do about 60 to 70 grams of prosciutto. So that equals about 3 or 4 slices, depending on how large the slices are. So this is a little bit of olive tapenade. I don't know if you can see in there. And we're just going to slap this kind of all over the board as well. And we can't forget a little bit of melon. So a little bit of melon, and I always put that nice and close to the prosciutto. Put a couple more slices here. And again, standing them up so that they're getting some height. You can get some height into the dish. And it looks just a little more interesting, a little more alive. These are our little pickled wild onions. So we just pop them around the dish as well. And what's left? Oh yeah, a couple grapes, because, you know, we have to feel like we're being healthy. So we're just going to put a few little bunches of grapes. Again, keeping them whole, propping them up so you get some really nice height in the dish. And then the vegetables. Now, I always do the vegetables last because they sort of give the most color to the dish. The green is sort of very important. So I do this last so that I can, you know, see where it needs to go. Fill in the blank spots. It's kind of like being a bit of an artist when you're doing this because you have to worry about, you know, composition a little. You want to spread out your colors. You don't want to just have a big giant, you know, ball of green in one corner and a ball of red in the other corner. And the nice thing about the asparagus and the beans, they're nice and long, so you can lean it on top of other ingredients and really build some height into your dish, like that. The last thing we have to put on, a couple more things. Sorry, a little bit of Parmigiano Reggiano. And again, if you don't have Parmigiano Reggiano, you can use Grana Padano. If you don't have Padano and you have some, I don't know, fior di latte, use that. Whatever cheese you have kicking around, it's not intended to be a meat and cheese platter. It's not something that requires 3 kinds of meat, 3 kinds of cheese. It's just better to focus on 1 kind of meat, 1 kind of cheese, and a whole lot of other stuff. The whole lot of other stuff is kind of what makes it a contadino platter, a nice big farm platter, and a replacement for lunch, as opposed to a little snack. So these are some Focaccia Crisps. So a little bit of focaccia, just drizzled with some olive oil, a little sprinkle of salt and pepper, and toasted in the oven at 400 degrees. And we just layer these around. This is, again, a very simple, my go-to when my son is hungry and I need to feed him quick. I just grab whatever's in the fridge, put it onto a platter, but you want to make sure that you have a nice mix of everything. You have the prosciutto, you have some vegetables, you have some preserves, the olives. If you like pickled eggplant, throw pickled eggplant on there. If you like pickles, you know what? Throw a pickle on there. Not the greatest food pairing with prosciutto, but the idea is you want people to just be able to pick things up and sample. Have a piece of bread with an artichoke. Have a piece of bread with the tomatoes, which I forgot to put on. Have a piece of bread with the mushroom, and they just keep on going back. And every bite is a new little flavor. So the more stuff you put on, the better the whole dish is. But again, you can see I'm gonna take the camera and kind of hold the platter up so that you can see that there is some negative space, that you can see the bottom of the board. If you cover it up too much so that you don't see the bottom of the board, it just looks too busy. So don't get dizzy as I'm moving the camera. Wow. So you can see from the top that there is some negative space. You can see that the board at the bottom here, and it doesn't look crowded, but there is a ton of food on this plate. So you can serve this. It doesn't look too crazy, but it is super tasty and super filling. A wonderful, wonderful substitution for a lunch.
That's great. Somebody's saying
cool.
You're painting
Any questions
picture.
Or
somebody's saying you're painting a picture with the food. Love it.
That's exactly. I mean, that's one of the most fun parts for me as a chef, is actually putting dishes together, actually making them pretty. The cooking is fun, but making it look pretty, I don't know. To me, I really enjoy that part too. So Roberto, any questions before we move on?
Why is the prosciutto and melon so good? I saw you added melon to the board there.
Oh, sorry, you just cut out there for a second, Tiziana.
Oh, sorry. Why is I repeat? Why is prosciutto and melon so good? Can you hear me?
Oh, there. You just came back.
Sorry. Okay, so I'll try again. Why is prosciutto and melon so good? I saw you put it on it's on the board.
Prosciutto and melone, it's like one of the most classic uses for prosciutto. And it's been around forever. And the reason it's so good is it's a mystery. There are certain food pairings that just work incredibly well. With the melon, it's the sweetness of the melon versus the saltiness of the prosciutto. The contrast of texture, even because the prosciutto, you know, even when it's sliced nice and thin, it's still a piece of meat and it's still cured. So it has a bit of a chew to it, whereas the melon is super soft. So the flavor pairing, it's been around and it's a classic for a reason. Why chemically? I don't know. I'd like to spend some time and do some research on that. But it's almost so good that you don't need to question it. Just do it. Figs are another one. Figs work really well with prosciutto. In my opinion, not as well as melon, but they're a little bit, you know, a little prettier, a little different. But yeah, prosciutto and melone, it's salty, sweet, it's savory. It's got everything you need in 2 simple ingredients.
Perfect. So how many people would that platter feed as an appetizer platter?
I would do that for 1 person.
That's great.
Yeah, because it's like 6 pieces of toast, 4 pieces of tomato, 5 pieces of tomato, 3 slices of prosciutto. It's not, because it's a substitute for lunch, right?
That's right.
So it's kind of taking Italian ingredients, serving them in a North American way where you eat 1 plate, not a pasta, a meat, contorni, desserts. It's 1 platter. You put it in front of everybody, and that's why it's always important to make sure that you have lots of vegetables, even some fruit on there, like the melons. You can put apples on there. You can put pears. They all work really well with prosciutto. So yeah, it's a substitute to a lunch.
And did you make the focaccia, or did you buy the focaccia crisps?
I made them. So I just took a piece of focaccia. I was going to show you, but I'm afraid I'm going to run out of time. So yeah, it's just a piece of focaccia that I cut thin, and then drizzle of olive oil, salt and pepper, 400 degrees. It takes about 7 minutes, and you have little focaccia crisps. This is a little round focaccia, but they come in all different sizes. So
that's great. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, so we're going to move on to the pasta. So tiny bit of prep for our pasta. First thing are mushrooms. So I just have a little mix of mushrooms here. So a little bit of creminis, there's some oysters, some kings. I'm just going to show you very quickly how to prep your mushrooms. These are oyster mushrooms, and sometimes you get them, they're nice and small. Sometimes you get them and they're giant like this. If they're large like this, all we want to do is just grab them and tear them into small pieces. We want them to be nice and small so that they fit onto a fork and you don't have to wrestle with them to get them onto your fork. If they're nice and small like this, you just leave them whole. But the big guys, you just sort of tear them into small little strands of mushrooms. Next is our cremini mushrooms. Now, I don't know how to say this politely. Don't wash your mushrooms. That was pretty polite. A lot of people, a lot of recipes I see, they say wash your mushrooms. Don't wash mushrooms. Mushrooms are like little sponges. If you put this into water, they will absorb all of the water and get really dense and really not so nice. So I'm going to show you how to clean your mushrooms to ensure that you don't get any dirt in your dish without washing them and destroying their texture. So first thing we do is we just pick out our stem. Stem comes out really easy. I keep that for vegetable stock, or you bruise the outside. It's not ideal. So the best thing to do is you just take your thumb, put it under the edge of the mushroom, and peel the cap off. This is why I love cremini mushrooms. I love the flavor of cremini mushrooms, but I love the fact that in 4 seconds, you can make it absolutely perfectly clean. So if a little piece sticks, sometimes you get a little piece sticking, you can just peel it off. No dirt whatsoever. Same with this side, or sorry, this one. Give it a quick peel and no dirt. The one thing you want to be careful of is when you're doing this, don't do it on top of your container of mushrooms, or else you're just going to be pushing the dirt from your mushroom into your next container. So that's our other mushroom. We're just going to nice and thin. And our other ingredients, just a little bit of shallot, a little bit of garlic, which I'm going to do very quickly for you. And then we're going to start cooking. So that's our mushrooms into our bowl, all ready to go. So our next ingredient is garlic. If you watch this, you've heard me rant about garlic before. You've heard me say, don't use a garlic press. Don't mack it. Don't smash it with your knife like this. That's not cool either. Take your garlic, trim off the butt end where the root is, and then cut it almost all the way through, right up the middle, just like this, okay? Then when you open it up, you can see that quite often we get these little green shoots in there. We want to make sure we remove that. That is not very fun to eat. So we pick this out, and we pick this one out, and we're just going to slice it super thin. There's also the way of, I see recipes where they call for putting salt with it, mashing it with your knife onto a cutting board. I really don't like that method. I find it bruises the garlic and it really changes the flavor of it. So all I do is nice, thin, super thin slices when you get to the end, watch your fingers. If you feel uncomfortable with this, then you can use a mandolin. But even if they're a little bit thicker, it's all right. It's better to have a nice clean cut of garlic than to have one that's all mashed up and all kinds of crazy. So our garlic is there, and we're going to add a little bit of shallots as well. So shallots, very similar process. We just take off the root end and cut it in half. I'm only going to use a half a shallot. Check to make sure, because even shallots get that green sort of shoot in the middle. So if you see it green or even a little bit yellow like this one, I just pull it out. It's not very appetizing. It doesn't taste very good. And it's also really hard for a lot of people to digest. So we just get rid of it. We have our shallot, and I'm going to do the same preparation as I did for the garlic, and just very, very, very thin slice, as thin as you can get it. What I usually say is try not to cut it, and the amount that you miss by is how thick you want it. Okay. Any questions, Tiziana?
Well, there was one about smashing the garlic, but you already answered it. So another question that I got is, like, if you don't like the fat, can you trim off the fat of the prosciutto and still be okay?
Oh, sorry.
You didn't hear me?
I'm sorry, Tiziana, you cut out a second there.
Yeah, so if you don't like too much fat, can you trim off the fat of the prosciutto?
If you could trim the fat of the prosciutto?
Yes, if you don't like too much fat.
I mean, you can trim off the prosciutto, but you shouldn't. The fat off of the prosciutto, but you shouldn't. That's where the flavor is. That's where all the wonderful flavor from the air that the prosciutto is cured in. That's where the salt penetrates the most. It's where most of the flavor is. So once you trim off that fat, you're left with a piece of cured meat. Yeah, it still has a lot of flavor in it, but the fat the fat's the best. So really, when you think about it, if you're eating 2 or 3 or 4 slices of prosciutto, it looks like a lot of fat, but it really isn't. If you're eating it every day, okay, fine. May not be the greatest, even though I do every day, I eat prosciutto. But if you trim it off, you're just sort of setting yourself up to not enjoy it at its best. You can still do it, absolutely, if you're that concerned about it, but it's going to be a little bit drier. It's going to be a little bit tougher because you don't have that fat melting on your palate. But I mean, yeah, if you're that concerned about it, trim it off. But try it first without trimming, and you'll see just how much better it is.
Perfect. Okay.
Okay.
Do we have time for another question, or would you like to proceed?
Yeah, go ahead.
So somebody's asking, what is the difference in preference between shallots and small onions?
I can't hear.
What is the difference in preference between shallots and small onions?
So it has a little more flavor than an onion, a little more, stronger flavor than an onion. It's just a completely different animal. It's a different, sorry, not animal, a different vegetable. So I use it quite a bit because onions themselves are not, a little bit boring. And if I want to build a little more flavor into it, then I use shallots. So in this recipe, I'm going to use both. I'm going to use shallots and some garlic, but very little of both. 1 clove of garlic and a half of a shallot. So I'm just going to mix them together because they're all going into the pan at the same time. Okay, so we're going to move over to the stove and I'm going to start cooking. All right. So we have our water. We have a frying pan that is crazy hot. So I put this on back before we actually started doing the class. It's only on like a number 4, but I want it nice and hot. And this is a nice heavy bottom frying pan. And the reason is simple. When we cook mushrooms, we want to do it over very, very, very high heat. If you cook mushrooms over low heat, what happens is the water from the mushrooms sort of escapes and you end up with like mushy, runny, I don't know, not very nice texture mushrooms. So get a nice close up here. You're going to see how you cook mushrooms properly. First thing we do, like I said, let our pan get hot, like hotter than you think is good. Hotter to the point where you're almost a little bit nervous to start cooking in it. So our pan is there. We put our mushrooms into it without anything else in there. There's no fat. And you can see how big the pan is. It's a large pan. We don't want to crowd our mushrooms. So they'll start to hiss. They'll start to make some noise. They'll start to slowly cook a little bit. And all we're going to do now is slowly start adding some butter. So I have some butter that's diced up and ready to go. And we just slowly start putting it in. The butter is going to kind of smoke. It's going to go brown very quickly. It might actually ignite. It might actually catch on fire. Don't worry about it. Just make sure that you have a pan that is larger than this one, so that if you have a little bit of flames coming up, you can just snuff it out with another pan. So you can see that the mushrooms are starting to go brown already. So just from that little bit of cooking, you can see that the mushrooms are nice and brown. So that's what we want. This could have been a little bit hotter too. Make sure you unplug your smoke detector because it's probably going to go off when you do this. But a quick little saute. Now, as the mushrooms cook, they'll start absorbing the butter. And that's what we want. We want the mushrooms to have a nice hard saute and be nice and brown and nice and crispy and absorb all that butter so that on the inside, they're full of fat and nice and beautiful and delicious and awesome. So if they absorb a lot of fat, you just put more butter into it. You can see in the bottom of the pan, there's a little bit of fat just kind of hanging out, a little bit of butter. That's what you're looking for. If it gets too dry, throw a little bit more butter in there. So just give this a little saute. All right. Now, the pan is not crazy hot now. Once we put the mushrooms into it, the temperature of the pan will drop quite a bit. So once it cools down, we can add our garlic and our shallots that we chopped up earlier. So we just put that in, and you can see it's not making too much noise. It's not being too aggressive. And if you want, you can stir it if you're not comfortable with doing the saute. But as soon as the mushrooms and the shallots go in, they'll start to cook, and you'll see that they'll dry up the pan a little bit more. If you look at the pan, they're dry now. That little bit of butter that was in the bottom was already absorbed. So what we're going to do is add a little more butter. Why not? That's the secret between restaurants and people at home. We cook with way more butter than you do at home. So we give this a little saute, let that butter dissolve, let that butter melt, and let the onions and the mushrooms absorb all of that fat. All right. So we're going to let that cook for a couple minutes. Are there any questions, Tiziana?
Not with regards to this step, but there was a question about the best way to clean the cutting board.
Oh, if you have stains on it?
Yes, and it says that I have one the size that you had, and obviously it doesn't fit in the dishwasher. Is it okay to use diluted bleach solution?
I bleach mine all the time, but before I bleach it, I take kosher salt and lemon juice.
Oh.
So throw some kosher salt on top of it, and then a little bit of lemon juice, and scrub the cutting board with the salt and lemon juice, and it usually takes up most of the stains on the cutting board. There are times, after time, or if you're using, turmeric or using paprika, where you'll get a really bad stain. And then I will use a little bit of bleach, diluted bleach, but I try and stay away from it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
Okay, so what we're going to do next is we're going to start making the sauce. This is sort of most of the dish is here. The mushrooms, the onions, the garlic. That's where a lot of the flavor comes from. But our other ingredient is kind of the most important one, and that is the prosciutto di Parma. So what I'm going to do is just tear this up into little pieces, and I'm going to put it right into the pan. Don't worry about how big they are, especially these ones, because they're going to cook and they're going to get a little bit crunchy. You can pre-tear this if you want, but I don't know. It's kind of fun to stand over the pot. I feel like my grandmother when I do this, start tearing pieces up and throwing it right into the pan. An homage to Nonna. And we're just going to give this a quick little saute. And we don't want to cook it too much, and we don't want to cook it too aggressively. If we cook it properly, the fat from the prosciutto will render out and kind of go into the bottom of the pan, and you'll see little bits of the fat kind of pooling in the bottom of the pan. That's pretty cool. That's all we need is that was what, 15, 20 seconds, just to let some of that fat get out. And then we add our chicken stock. So a little bit of chicken stock, not too much. Well, I'm doing 2, so I'll put a little bit more. That's about 250 milliliters of chicken stock. And we slowly let that reduce. Now, this is where I usually drop my pasta, because after this, all we have to do is cheese and peas, and we're done. So a little bit of Orecchiette pasta. I'm using dried stuff because, I don't know, I didn't have time to make fresh. Sorry. So dried pasta right into some nice, well-salted water. Now, if you come over and take a look, you'll see that I don't have a ton of water. Now, generally, when you cook pasta, you want a lot more water than this. But what I'm doing is I'm using a lot less water intentionally because I want the water to be nice and starchy. The reason is I'm going to use some of the pasta water for the sauce. So if I do it like normal, where you take, 4 parts water to 1 part pasta, then what ends up happening is your water isn't super starchy. And then when you go to cook it, you add some pasta water to it, and all it really does is water down your pasta sauce, which is not cool. So with this, we're going to get a nice starchy bit of water that we're going to use to thicken up our sauce right at the end. So we just have, everything's kind of chilling here. I'm not adding any salt. I'm not adding any pepper. And that is the joy of cooking with prosciutto di Parma, is that if you eat it on its own, yeah, some people think it's kind of too salty. But if you cook with it, then you don't add salt anywhere else. Even the water for the pasta is very, very lightly salted because I want the prosciutto to shine through. I want to use the flavor of that prosciutto to make the sauce delicious without having to use any extra salt. I just want the sauce, the prosciutto itself, to do all the flavoring and all the seasoning. So our sauce is going to be reducing. Our pasta is simmering. I have some time to kill. So, any questions?
Yeah, I have a question about the saucepan. Should it be a non-stick or Teflon pan?
I kind of stay away from Teflon and non-stick. Basically, if you know how to cook, you don't need Teflon. Teflon is sort of a way of cheating. If you're cooking properly, you're using the right temperatures, and you're prepping your ingredients properly, nothing will stick to a pan. So I have a couple Teflon pans kicking around, but I rarely go to them. These are my 2 most go-to pans, these cast iron pans. Honestly, of the hundreds of pans I have here, I use these more than anything. That's why they're right beside the stove.
That's great. And how about the ratio of water to orecchiette? What's the ratio you recommend to get the starchy water?
So in this one, I put about a half of a bag, so about 250 grams of dried pasta, and I have about 1.5 liters of water in that pot. Very, very little. And if you have a good pot, it'll come back up to a boil very quickly. So you don't have to worry about the pasta overcooking or getting all mushy and not cooking properly. You just do a small portion and throw it in. If you're going to do 4 people, then you do 2 liters of water and a full bag of pasta. Wow. if you're cooking for my family anyway. 500 grams will only feed 4 people.
Thank you, Chef.
No problem. So our sauce is starting to simmer here. It's starting to come down. It's starting to get thick. Our pasta is cooking, and please, please, please cook your pasta properly. Al dente. Everybody knows what al dente means, right? Little bit of bite. When I first started hand making pasta in my first restaurant where I was executive chef back in the, well, it was back a while ago. It was very common for me to have to be called to a table to explain to people that their pasta wasn't undercooked. They were used to pasta being super mushy, basically like mashed potatoes that were formed into a shape. Pasta shouldn't be like that. You should have to chew your pasta. You should have a little bit of a bite. Train your family, train your friends to eat the pasta that way. It's just much more enjoyable. So with our prosciutto, in here, you can see the prosciutto is starting to like get all wrinkly, and it's starting to get super, super tender. So if I hold this up, you can see that it just sort of like crumbles apart in your hand. That's just from a nice low, slow cooking. Now we're gonna add a little bit of raw prosciutto a little bit later on, but for now, we're just gonna let this go. So this is where we take the pot off the stove. So you can see that all that chicken stock, all that liquid is almost gone. It's quite dry. So if you want, you can add a little bit more chicken stock, but I don't want to. I don't want to over flavor it with chicken. I want the flavor of the prosciutto to be the star. So I'm going to just take it off while our pasta cooks. The last thing we have to add is our peas. So these are just a little bit of peas that have been blanched. So they were in the water, in and out of the water, raw peas in and out of the water in about, it was probably about 20 seconds into boiling water. 20 seconds in, you take them out, put them into a bowl and just leave them there. And they'll finish cooking as they cool down. So our peas go in, we toss that around. Because these are already cooked, all we're really doing is warming this up. So you can see our sauce is nice and dry now. So waiting for our pasta to cook. We get to try one. Nope, it only needs a few minutes. So that means we have a few minutes to chat. What's going on, Tiziana?
So yeah, well, I have some questions here. I have some questions here about the skin of the prosciutto. Somebody wants to know if there is any use for it, if you can use it somehow.
Absolutely. So what I always do with the skin of the prosciutto is I keep it all. I peel the prosciutto when I clean it. The skin goes into like a 1 liter container, like the little, plastic deli containers that you always have a million of kicking around at your house, and throw it in the freezer. And then when that liter gets full, I make a prosciutto stock. So I put it just like a chicken stock, just like a beef stock, making a brodo. You put it into a pot with some cold water, carrot, celery, and onion. Usually I throw a bay leaf in there. Fresh herbs, I just go out, grab some fresh herbs, whatever's growing, and I put it into a pot of water and I simmer it. Bring it up to a boil and then drop it down to a very light simmer and let it simmer for, you only really need a couple hours, 2 hours, and then you strain it off and you have all the flavor of the prosciutto in a liquid. And then I use that to make, instead of using chicken stock for this, you can use prosciutto stock. When you make a soup, use prosciutto stock. You make anything, you use that and you have a ton of flavor in it.
That's great. That's great suggestions. Yeah. And listen, would asparagus work instead of peas in this recipe?
Absolutely, absolutely. So with this recipe, again, recipes should always be considered guidelines. If you don't have if you don't have fresh peas, use asparagus. So I just have to move this so I don't whack my head on it. Use asparagus. If you only have green beans, use green beans. Whatever, just a little bit of green in this dish, a little bit of, vegetable flavor really works incredibly well with the prosciutto itself. So you want to stay on the sweet side. I mean, peas work the best. I find they work the best anyway, because they're really sweet. And just like the prosciutto and melone, the sweetness of the peas really complements the prosciutto in this pasta.
Perfect. And how about prosciutto cotto on the deli counter? Is that a type of prosciutto, or is it something like a different ingredient or product?
Yeah, so prosciutto cotto it's similar to prosciutto, but very different. Prosciutto cotto isn't cured in the same way. It's not hung for 2 years. It's more of it's a fresh ham that is cured, but then they're cooked. So they're steamed usually. And the flavor profile, the texture, everything is very different. So it's more like a ham, more like a Black Forest ham without the smoking flavor. So it has a ton of flavor. I love prosciutto cotto. You can ask my zia in Italy the one day. It's not prosciutto di Parma. It's not prosciutto di Parma. Prosciutto di Parma in Italy, in Emilia-Romagna, we don't even specify prosciutto di Parma. When we talk about prosciutto, we talk about crudo and cotto. Cotto being the cooked one, crudo being raw. I mean, it translates literally to raw, even though it's not raw. It's cured for 2 years, but it's always prosciutto di Parma. When you're talking about crudo, it's always prosciutto di Parma. There's no options. Yeah, there's no option. Well, you could, but you might have to leave the region. They might kick you out. So you can see the pasta. Let me just move this over here. You can see how there's not a lot of water on top of the pasta. Come on. So you see how the noodles, the actual orecchiette, are almost right up to the top of the water. And see how the water is really white and cloudy. That's what we want. That's where all the beautiful starchy flavor is. So they're almost done. Yep. So we take a little bit of the nice starchy water and we put it right into the pan to make our sauce. Right now it's really, really dry. So we add our pasta water, we give it a little stir, and we're just going to let that reduce again for another minute or so. And now we're going to taste to make sure that, see if we need a little bit of salt, see if we do need a little bit of pepper. Oh no. Oh man, that's awesome. Oh man, that's good.
Good.
I gotta hurry up so I can eat this. Okay, so what I'm doing here is I'm not going to use, what are those called? Pasta strainers. I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to use a little holy spoon to pull it out. That way I keep the pasta water. Just in case, after I get the noodles into the pan and I give it a little toss, if I do need a little extra water, I can always go back in, pull a little water out of the pot. If you don't want to do this, if you don't have a nice big slotty spoon, then you can strain it through a pasta strainer, but make sure you strain it into another pot so that you have that pasta water available. So we just take that out, and you can see by the time we're done, most of the water has either been evaporated or absorbed into the pasta. So that pot of water we started, it was up here. So of that 1.5 liters, almost 1 liter has been evaporated or absorbed into your pasta. So we take the noodles, we toss it in, make a mess of our stove. You know, that's the important part. And we just give it a toss. This is going to tell us if we need to add more liquid. You don't want it soupy, but you need a little bit of liquid so that you have something to like soak up with a little piece of bread. So we give it a toss, we analyze it. That's a little bit dry. So I'm just going to take a little bit more of the pasta water and throw it in. And once the pasta is in, you can take it off the heat. If you feel, you know, a little nervous keeping it on top of the heat cooking, but you can see how much liquid is in the bottom of the pan. There's a little bit, I'd say about a 1/16 of an inch, maybe an 1/8 of an inch of pasta water. And we just give it a toss so they're nicely coated. This is why I love doing orecchiette with this, is when you get that. It just so it happens that the peas kind of end up inside of the orecchiette. I don't know. Cooks are weird. So now that that's done, we have one last ingredient, and we're going to go back over to the cutting board to actually plate
Cheese.
this. Goes
So
down
what kind
here.
of cheese do you have there?
La, la, la,
Parmigiano Reggiano.
So prosciutto di Parma is a wonderful, wonderful ingredient. If you're going to take the time to use real prosciutto di Parma, to take the time to make this pasta, don't cut corners with the cheese. Don't buy Parmesan. Don't get the pre-grated cardboardy, sawdusty kind of nastiness. You want to use real Parmigiano Reggiano. So the last thing that we have to do here is take a little bit of the prosciutto, the sliced prosciutto. Now this one's kind of sweating. It's kind of oily because it's been out at room temperature. And we're just going to fire this back into the pot. So we have the prosciutto that's cooked off, and we have a little bit of the fresh prosciutto as well, just so that you get the best of both worlds. We have the beautiful chew of the fresh prosciutto and all the flavor and like a very soft, delicate little piece of the cooked prosciutto. So if you see, this just like totally tears apart super easy, the cooked piece. And yes, I'm cooking for myself, so I'm using my hands. And all we have to do now is finish it with a little bit of Parmigiano Reggiano. So in our bowl, this is how I always assemble my pastas. The first thing I do is I take some of our grated Parmigiano Reggiano and I put that in the bottom of the bowl. So that as you're digging around, you get a nice little, your last few mouthfuls of pasta are nice and cheesy, nice and delicious. You don't have to worry so much about mixing your cheese right into your pastas. That way it's there. It's a nice little surprise. It's pretty awesome. We toss our pasta and you can see in the bottom of the pan, we have a nice thick sauce. The liquid is really thickened up from the starch of the pasta water. And we just plate this on top of the cheese. I don't mind if a little bit is kind of sticking out the sides, really isn't a big deal. And we take a little bit of our water, make sure that we get a little bit of sauce on there. That's your pasta.
So tasty.
It is one of the easiest pastas to make. We throw a little bit of extra Parmigiano on top and not too heavy because you kind of want it to melt so that you can see. And see again how that happens? Pea inside the orecchiette, pea inside there, pea inside there. I love it when that happens. Sometimes if I have time, I'll even take like the rogue pea that's way over here and I'll just make sure it goes inside. So super easy, super easy pasta that I usually get done within, like I said, I'll usually start the sauce when I drop the pasta into the water. And you can get this whole dish done, as long as you have your garlic and your onions chopped, you can get this whole dish done in the 10 minutes it takes to actually cook your noodles.
This is great. You put any olive oil on top or no?
You could put a little drizzle of olive oil on top. Absolutely nothing wrong with that. Here, this is Tiziana's. You better get over here.
No, somebody was asking from the chat, actually.
Yeah, no, you can.
Yeah.
Well, whoever asked has to get over here and eat this pasta. Now, generally with this, I usually don't put a ton of herbs. I don't like throw a big, bunch of basil on there because the prosciutto di Parma is really carrying the dish. It's where all the flavor is coming from in this. Chicken stock adds a bit of richness. Pasta water gives it the sauciness. Mushrooms give it a bit of earthiness. And the peas sort of sweeten the dish. But it all complements the prosciutto di Parma. And that's the whole idea. And there is no traditional name for this. It's just something that I make all the time. I don't know. I guess I should make a name for it.
Well, that looks fantastic. I wish I could try it, but thank you so thank you so much.
You're welcome
for this class. It was really interesting, lots of details and information. So
yay.
We'll see you again on November 10th. What are we going to prepare then?
Food
for us?
It's a surprise.
Oh, surprise. Okay. We'll let everybody know in our next communications.
Awesome.
Well, thank you so much, Roberto. That was great.
Thank you very much, Tiziana. And thanks everybody for watching. And again, if you have any questions that I didn't get to today, or you want to know anything about Prosciutto di Parma, just go to Instagram at Roberto Fracchioni. Ask me anything. Happy to blab about food anytime you want.
That's great. Well, I'd like to also add a special thank you to our sponsor, the Consorzio del Prosciutto di Parma. Thank you very much for sponsoring these classes and for letting us know a lot about Prosciutto di Parma, very interesting details. So thank you to my colleagues, Astrid, Isabella, Ilaria, and everybody at the chamber for making this possible. See you next week and buon appetito.